Okay, so we should be pretty live right about now. Okay, here we go. So, my name is Ian McLaughlin, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Pennsylvania in neuroscience. And last week was a very big week, last weekend actually, because I sent my boss, my PI, principal investigator, is the jargon that we use in biomedical science at least. I sent my PI what should be the last manuscript for the last academic publication that I will put out before I complete my PhD. And having recently had a kid and watching the whole birth process, oftentimes people will say that it was like giving birth, right? Like writing this paper, writing my thesis, which now I'm focused on, is like giving birth. And I can tell you it's not like giving birth. It's not quite that bad. But it might be the closest thing that those of us who lack uteruses and ovaries might experience. It was brutal. In fact, and maybe I'll like tweet out this picture or something, there was a point where I was typing and I noticed that there was blood on my keyboard, and it was because I had sort of worn down the skin on my pinky. Not because I was typing, I was like playing guitar for the baby, but yeah, it was a pretty evocative experience. Anyways, so that is why I wasn't live on Sunday, and so I'm making it up now. And so as Game of Thrones was wrapping up, HBO was heavily pushing a TV show or a series that they called Chernobyl. Chernobyl is, of course, the name of a nuclear power plant that underwent some severe disaster and was destroyed. It became sort of like a notorious example of what can go wrong with nuclear power, right? And so I watched the whole show. I thought it was really good, really intense, particularly in the depictions of folks who had undergone some, radiation poisoning, in biology, when you're going through either college or certainly graduate school, you learn about how various kinds of radiation can interfere and damage biology, but you never really study, at least not through the classes that not in the classes that I went through, you never really study like a literal case of somebody who was exposed to high levels of radiation. And so I just sort of like assumed, yeah, okay, it was really intense. I mean, not for the squeamish of stomachs to watch those scenes, but it basically turned these people, at least in the depiction in the show, turned these people into what looked sort of like the undead, like zombies. And so, yeah, I'd sort of believed it. And then I saw that this article had come out that was written by somebody named Robert Gale, who's an MD and a PhD. And he is an expert in leukemia and bone marrow. And I don't know if he's still working today, but he has a pretty long and storied career. He's worked at places like Rockefeller University and UCLA, both of which are fabulous biomedical institutions. And he's gotten just a ton of awards. You can look him up. He's clearly a very accomplished scientist, biomedical scientist. And so at the time of the Chernobyl incident, Robert Gale was working at UCLA, and evidently he contacted the then president of the USSR, Mikhail Gorbachev, following the sort of publication of the disaster, saying, offering some assistance. And I should say, before I go much deeper into his reaction to the Chernobyl HBO TV series, that I've seen like a bunch of other biomedical scientists internationally just sort of endorse him, just say like implicitly, I know Robert Gale and he's the real deal. I could list them off, but like, for example, one was a professor emeritus of biochemistry at the University College Cork named Tom Cotter. But so anyways, like sort of central to Dr. Robert Gale's critique of the Chernobyl TV show was to portray the victims of the nuclear fallout as being dangerously radioactive. And he wrote this in something called the Cancer Letter, which I suppose is like an email newsletter type of thing, but you can find it online. You don't need to be subscribed, in other words. And so, as I said, Gale is an expert in bone marrow transplantation that is used to treat radiation victims, and he was an expert since before Chernobyl, the Chernobyl incident occurred. And so Gale reached out to Gorbachev, who then promptly asked him to come to Chernobyl immediately. And so here I have a couple of quotes from Gale's accounting of the story. And so he says, quote, "I spent the next 2 years mostly in the Soviet Union working with my colleagues at the Institute for Biophysics and Clinical Hospital 6, which I suppose is just a specific hospital in USSR at the time." So, resuming, quote, "dealing with a bit more than 200 persons with acute radiation exposures. In the subsequent 30 years, I have been involved in several studies of the long-term medical consequences of the accident, initially in the ex-Soviet Union and later in the Russian Federation, Ukraine, and Belarusia." He calls it Belarusia, end quote. He calls it Belarusia. It's Belarus is what we would call it today. And so he then just sort of like goes kind of point by point by point about what the TV show got wrong. So the first thing that they got wrong, according to Gale, is that the firefighters who suffered from acute radiation syndrome, they were not contagious. So they were sort of portrayed in the HBO show as being extraordinarily dangerous to even be around because they were kind of contaminated with radiation, and therefore anybody around them would then also be exposed to dangerously high levels of radiation. It's according to him, that just wasn't the case. And here's another quote from Gale. "Most radiation contamination was superficial and relatively easily managed by routine procedures. This is entirely different from the 1987 Guyana in Brazil accident, where the victims ate 137 cesium, which was evidently from an old teletherapy machine, and so they basically just had like isolate these folks from most medical personnel. But they had, again, consumed something that was radioactive. And so the firefighters were not like dangerously contagious with radiation exposure, right? And then kind of midway through the show, well, the show opens up with this young couple, a woman and a man, maybe late 20s, early 30s. And the man, ultimately, it is shown, is one of the firefighters that respond, a first responder, I suppose, of the Chernobyl incident. And then he became hospitalized along with a couple other firefighters who were, again, portrayed as being contagious in their radiation. And then so the wife of this guy, who was just melting, essentially, she shows up. It's sort of implied that she's pregnant. The physicians really urge her to not, or just one physician, really urge her to avoid her husband, and she just decides not to, right? And then ultimately, the show goes on, and you find out that the baby was not successfully carried. And the show portrays this as being due to the fact that the baby absorbed deadly amounts of radiation from her dying father, right? Because the wife was around the firefighter who was the father of her child, just sort of hugging him and comforting him. Because again, they portrayed these victims of acute radiation poisoning as just becoming sort of like zombies. Anyway, so there's a scientist in the show who says the radiation would have killed the mother, but the baby absorbed it instead. And there is some interesting, biochemistry or just biology to the idea that a fetus might absorb a lot more might sort of like be a sponge for certain kinds of molecules. But according to Gale, there is no record that event even occurred, and Gale says that it could not have happened. So here's a quote from Gale. "Lastly, there is dangerous representation that because one of the victims was radioactive, his pregnant wife endangered her unborn child by entering the hospital room. First, as discussed, none of the victims were radioactive. Their exposures were almost exclusively external, not internal. More importantly, risk to a fetus from an exposure like this is infinitesimally small. For example, amongst the several hundred pregnant women exposed to high-dose radiation from the A-bombs in World War II, there were only 229 children with attributable developmental defects. All were exposed in the second trimester, when cells are migrating from to the brain from the neural crest. So that's sort of the development of the fetal nervous system. And so, sort of interestingly, this reminds me of this is sort of faded from the news consciousness or national consciousness, but the Zika virus. It seemed to be the case that only when pregnant women were exposed during certain periods of their pregnancy were any of the developmental defects observed. So Gale's just making the point that the vast majority of the fallout from those A-bombs did not result in developmental defects that were attributed to the radiation, and it was just like the select few that happened to be exposed in just the worst possible way developmentally. So then he goes on. Gale says, quote, "The effects of radiation poisoning are portrayed as something horrendous, unimaginable. This is inaccurate. In doing hematopoietic cell transplant, we commonly expose people to much higher radiation doses than received by any of the Chernobyl victims. So do radiation therapists. We know what the toxicities are, and we are reasonably effective in mitigating them." So in other words, the levels of radiation that these folks would have encountered wasn't remotely as high as the show sort of portrayed them as being exposed to. And people regularly in other clinical settings are exposed to even higher levels of radiation. And we have methods to ameliorate the ramifications of being exposed to those high levels of radiation. And so he then highlights the fact that most of the injuries that were experienced by the firefighters, again, that were first responders to the Chernobyl incident, most of the injuries experienced by them were mostly synchronous injuries that make people more susceptible to radiation damage and can kill people even if you successfully reverse the radiation-induced damage. So they had other injuries, maybe open wounds or something like that, that rendered them a little bit more vulnerable to being exposed to radiation. But even if they were not exposed to radiation, they would have potentially experienced some kind of negative health consequence or fatality. And so that's interesting. It's tough for me to verify that. I don't really have any background in specifically like power plant nuclear radiation exposure or anything like that. So I take him at his word. But it is just one physician. I assume that there will be a kind of a discussion between multiple physicians because this guy's pretty well known. But then he goes on to what I think is perhaps a more interesting point. And that is that the fearmongering about radiation resulted in many women unnecessarily terminating their pregnancies. So, in other words, because the broader population, of course, the vast majority of whom don't have any background in biomedical science, let alone nuclear physics, because they don't really know what the ramifications of being exposed to nuclear fallout is, and it's not like something like Chernobyl happens all the time. They assume the worst, and there was evidently a lot of fear-mongering going on, and this resulted in people making the decision to avoid what they thought would be an inevitable developmental defect in their fetuses. And so here's a quote from him. "We estimate incorrect advice from physicians regarding the relationship between maternal radiation exposure from Chernobyl and birth defects resulted in more than 1 million unnecessary abortions in the Soviet Union and Europe. Ignorance is dangerous." So that was very interesting. It's certainly not something that I had ever heard. That's a lot of abortions, regardless of how you feel about abortion. If let's just assume that some percentage of these women, perhaps some very large percentage of these women, would have preferred to, maintain their pregnancy, and it was just this misinformation that caused them to make these decisions. So there's some other things that he identified about his own experience differing from that portrayed by the HBO Chernobyl series. And so one was that the Soviet Union in the show was extremely reluctant to seek outside help. They didn't want anybody from outside of the USSR coming in to intervene or give assistance. And Gale's experience differs quite a bit. He says that he was invited to Moscow shortly after the event, and he was allowed, or he asked and was allowed to bring 3 colleagues. Here's another quote from him. "In my experience dealing with nuclear accidents, this is rather unusual and indicates a desire to do everything possible to help the victims, throwing politics to the wind. And whilst in Moscow, we were free to expropriate supplies and equipment from many Russian medical centers. Even more extraordinary, when I requested the Soviets allow me to bring an Israeli scientist to help, there were no diplomatic relations with Israel at the time, they agreed, albeit with some arm twisting." So again, I don't know enough about the politics at the time of the USSR, and it is definitely the case that the show makes some choices to portray the government in a certain way, right? In that there seemed to be a dominance of or a prioritization of loyalty and political connections over all else. Even if there are some wonderful expert who has a perfect expertise to solve this problem, even if they're telling them to do something, the political connections were sort of uber alles. And so again, I don't know if that's the case. This is also just Gale's experience as a physician, being invited in to help. And so it could be the case that depending upon with whom you kind of interfaced at the time, that you would have completely different experiences. In any case, and Gale, it seemed, was interfacing with at least sometimes Gorbachev himself, who would be in charge of all of this stuff, or at least people who worked directly with Gorbachev. So perhaps if you had interfaced with somebody who wasn't so senior, there would have been a completely different experience. But I think it's just worth noting, given the fact that he brings up these topics. And now, another interesting thing, and this seems to have happened a lot more frequently decades ago than it does today, but Gale, in the face of a lot of the fear-mongering that was going on, he brought his own family, to Kiev in Ukraine to reassure people that there is no need to evacuate. And he also used a novel treatment method, which he tested on himself. That is what I'm referring to, where a biomedical scientist will demonstrate the efficacy of one of their ideas by giving it to themselves. Generally speaking, these days, not the best idea. Like, we see some kind of reckless applications of things like, CRISPR-Cas9 in sort of citizen scientist movements. And it doesn't seem that there's been anything all that negative that have come out of that. But even still, you never know, right? But so in this case, Gale recounts his experience with this novel treatment method. So, quote, "One interesting intervention suggested by Professor David Gold at UCLA was the use of a molecularly cloned hematopoietic growth factor, sargramostin," might be mispronouncing that, but sargramostin, had been tested in dogs and monkeys to increase granulocytes, but had not been given to humans. We brought it to the Soviet Union from Switzerland, hidden in a passenger's checked luggage with the permission of a Politburo Chernobyl commission. The problem is the Soviets didn't want the Chernobyl victims to be first humans to receive a new therapy. Excuse me. The solution was for Vorobiev and I to inject one another with sargramostin. We lived, and so we got permission to proceed. Which, that's certainly not how the FDA would prefer things proceed, at least in the modern United States. So, who knows? I take him at his word that he wouldn't be misleading on this. Oh, I forgot to bring the... That was dumb. Here's the poster for the TV show, in case you aren't sure and maybe you recognize... not sure you're familiar with it, but recognize the imagery. And I should say, there's a lot of really beautiful just cinematography and just beautiful shots. If you're my age, you might remember that one of the sort of earlier viral videos on the internet, I'm not talking like the primitive internet, but when the internet was sort of more widespread, more people had access to it, and videos, it didn't take you like 10 years to download a video. But one of them was a music video, and it was never clear for whom or who made this music and for whom the video was made and everything. But it's basically it's the music video for a song by Seguros, the Icelandic kind of abstract kind of band, where they're depicting a nuclear winter. And I would love to have a conversation with whomever was the sort of art director for this film, because there were a few scenes where it seemed like they were literally taking directly from, at least direct inspiration from, the Seguros Untitled, I think the old album was Untitled, music video that became very, very popular for a short period of time. So anyways, so Gale kind of rounds off his series of critiques of HBO's Chernobyl by putting Chernobyl itself, the incident itself, into a broader context, and highlighting the fact that it's not like that's the only incident related to power stations of various kinds, mines, nuclear power plants, or whatever it might be, and hydroelectric power and stuff like that. So here's a quote from him. Quote, "All governments try to contain bad news of this type. I see rather little difference between the initial U.S. government reaction to the 3 Mile Island accident, the initial Japan government reaction to the Fukushima Daiichi accident, and the Soviet response to Chernobyl. Although the 31 immediate Chernobyl-related deaths are sad, the number of fatalities is remarkably small compared with many energy-related accidents, such as the Banshihu coal mine disaster in China in 1942, which killed about 1,500 miners, and the 1975 Danqiao dam accident, also in China, which killed about 250,000 people." which is mind-blowing to me. I've definitely never heard of either one of those accidents. Certainly not the one that killed 250,000 people. That's mind-blowing. And if you can check out some simulations of like why it killed so many people, and you know, as is the case oftentimes with like the aftermath of a hurricane, a lot of the fatalities were due to secondary consequences. But still, my God, I mean, 250,000 people. That's wild. So again, you know, this is just the perspective of a physician who had very direct interaction with Chernobyl and the mitigation of damage resulting from the Chernobyl incident. And he seems to have his own perspective on the nature of the government. When he talks about how they had to sort of sneak some of their some of these treatments in, it seemed a little bit like he was kind of contradicting his previous account of how the USSR or how the government was completely amenable to essentially anything that he asked for. Why all the secrecy, if that were the case? But again, there are probably few people who are still alive who would have such direct experience with the Chernobyl incident. So it's an interesting account. Again, the physician's name is Robert Gale, MD, PhD, and I'm sure at this point, if you just type in Robert Gale, Gale, G-A-L-E, if you just type in Robert Gale Chernobyl into any search engine, you'll find it. And you know, it's interesting, particularly if you enjoyed the TV show. Yeah, if you haven't seen the TV show, it's worth watching. It's just remarkably done, very beautiful show, independently of what they might have gotten wrong. Okay, we are getting a call, and so let's see how this goes before I go on to the second issue. So you're calling from a 407 area code. What's your name? Where are you calling from? You there? I can't hear you. Are you there? You might need to call back in. Yeah, why don't you try calling back in? Okay. Sorry about that, folks. So if you'd like to call in, it's 267-579-2216. 267-579-2216. Okay. Oh. Okay. It's a different phone number. Calling from a 313 area code. What's your name? Where are you calling from? Huh. Calling from a 407 area code. What's your name? Where are you calling from? Are you there? Speakers. Yeah. Well, everything should be working. I'm not sure what's wrong here, but yeah, leave a comment in the live chat. I'll be able to see it there, and you'll be less able to troll me, which is I'm pretty sure what you're trying to do. All right. Oh, here we go. I think something's wrong with your Google Voice. Oh, it's a problem on our end. Oh no, I'm sorry to hear that. Shoot, it shouldn't be. Everything should be right. Sorry about that. I mean, if you can leave a comment in the live chat, I can see those. But anyways, yeah, just for anybody that's just watching now, this is about the I just talked about the Chernobyl, HBO's Chernobyl TV show, and a physician's critique of the show, and like all the things that they seem to have gotten wrong. A lot of it revolves around the way that acute radiation poisoning was portrayed in the show. But then also he has a broader critique of like how some of the fearmongering that went on in the aftermath of Chernobyl, leading to suboptimal decision making. Okay, let's try one more time. 407 area code. Microphone, speakers. What about that? Did that solve things? No, I mean, this should be working. Well, that's irritating. I'm sorry, folks. Oh, wait. No, it should be working. I mean, if I can hear the phone ringing, I should be able to hear you. Let's see if we do that. No. Huh. Microphone, speakers. No. Yeah, that as you can see, the speakers do work. Can you hear me? That is so weird. This has never happened before. Well, I am going to go live on Twitter in just a little while, and so you can call in there if you'd like. Sorry, that's not working, folks. Okay. I think your microphone is muted. When you respond to my call, I hear an echo sound. Beep, 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 beep. I like how people got red faces, I assume, in the show. Yeah, well, so exposure to radiation is definitely going to be painful, and you could definitely get burned. But it was more like Robert Gale, he's a physician scientist. He basically said it was more like the depiction of more terminal experiences of those patients who basically just began like melting. But then also, he highlights that a lot of the fear-mongering in the aftermath of the Chernobyl incident resulted in, he says, 1 million abortions. And at least, regardless of how you feel about abortion, at least some substantial percentage of those women probably would have preferred to not have an abortion. And so he sort of highlights the danger of misinformation and ignorance about radiation. So I recommend you check it out. You can also just rewind and I had a more prepared sort of run through. Okay, so the next story that I have for y'all is about the emergence of consciousness. And so this is the reason I'm covering this now. I mean, you could cover this at any point, really. There have been theories of consciousness for a very long time. But the reason I'm covering this now is that there's a book that has come out called The Evolution of the Sensitive Soul, which is written by Ginsberg and Jablonka, both scientists. And they are arguing that there's a more direct relationship, that we can sort of hone in on a specific period of evolutionary history that likely gave rise to consciousness. So let's get started. So there are some philosophers that basically summarize consciousness as being like emerging out of complex, reflective, self-conscious experience, and that if you don't experience those things, then you're not experiencing consciousness. And some neuroscientists and neurophilosophers will argue that as a result, even animals don't really have the level of consciousness that humans have, or baby humans. I have a little baby human. They would argue don't have quite the level of consciousness that fully grown brain adults have, fully grown adults with fully developed brains have. And then, there are other concepts of consciousness, like there's this concept, which I should say I do not endorse, called panpsychism, that argues that consciousness is everywhere, and even, things like atoms have their own form of consciousness. Again, I should say definitely don't endorse that concept of consciousness. And another time, perhaps, it would be fun to sort of go into and criticize some of these theories. But suffice it to say, there are a variety of theories. And so Simona Ginsberg and Eva Jablonka argue that that, again, we can tie consciousness to the emergence of consciousness to a particular event or period in evolutionary history. And so their theory is that, or they begin describing this by saying, for about 100 million years, from 635 to 542 million years ago, the first large multicellular organisms appeared on Earth. Right? So this is a very long time ago, and this has been referred to by paleontologists and so on, evolutionary biologists, as the Ediacaran Garden. And so there were just a ton of odd creatures who spent their lives on the ocean floor, and towards the end of this period, they tended to look more like slugs and worms, maybe things that we might recognize today. But most of the creatures for the majority of this period were completely unlike anything that we see today. And so an example is right next to me here, which is called Dickinsonia. And you can see, I don't know if maybe it's a little bit too small, but you can see a sort of a general anatomy. It's a very simple anatomy. It looks almost like a leaf, but it's not a plant. And so all of a sudden, most of this type of creature just seemed to have vanished. And this is between 530 and 520 million years ago, and they were replaced by a proliferation of animals who were very different from something like Dickinsonia. And so, for example, they were able to move, and there was the emergence of something like a nervous system, maybe even a primitive kind of brain. And they had things like eyes, right? And so they had a more complex nervous system that enabled them to seek out prey and avoid predators. And so, you know, one example is something like this, the Amylocaris. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but Anomalocaris, I should say. Anomalocaris, which you can see here. And then you can see the, wait, is this? Boom. You can see, yeah, one of my favorites. Oh, I see what's happening. Sorry, folks. You can see one of my favorites, the Opabinia, which again, don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but the Opabinia has this sort of interesting collection of 5 eyes, which is kind of odd to have an odd number of eyes, as well as this like proboscis with a grasping claw at the end. And you can see some of the fossils down here, and then an artist depiction up on top. And so, so there was this massive proliferation of these organisms, and so these creatures were all the ancestors of the current species of animals that we see today, including things like insects and crustaceans and mollusks, as well as early vertebrates, which are our own evolutionary ancestors. Again, this is, you know, several hundred million years ago. And so Ginsberg and Jablonka suggest that these animals succeeded from an evolutionary perspective because of a new selective factor in natural selection. And this was sort of a new basis on which creatures were competing for survival, and that was that they were able to store information about their environments. So it wasn't purely just input-output. They could interact with their environments meaningfully, and they could form a, it's not memory the way we think of it, but a sort of a nervous system equivalent of memory. And so but then, you know, so there was this simple sort of expansion of a kind of a nervous system. But then more interestingly to me, because in my dissertation I focus on studying the neurophysiology of anxiety and mood through the context of, or in the context of addiction. Ginsberg and Jablonka argue that at around this time was the emergence of something that we might consider to be sort of like ancestral emotions. So not like, you know, the emotions that we feel, not quite as thorough and vivid, but still the sort of emergence of a mood-like system guiding behavior. And so they experience, for example, a primitive form of desire. So sort of like, you know, a lion experiences the desire to pursue its prey, or, you know, a lion's prey experiences the desire to avoid being eaten by a lion. And so this period that we're talking about is called the Cambrian explosion. So they highlight this as a kind of the emergence of a new like arms race, evolutionary arms race. And so predators got better at seeing and moving and learning about their environment, and then their prey had to then evolutionarily develop countermeasures lest they no longer survive, right? Lest their predators win. And so along with the emergence of these primitive abilities came a sort of minimal form of consciousness. And so their ability to experience the world and have a kind of minimal perceptual experience was, they argue, a precursor to a more complex consciousness that, you know, animals like us exhibit, including things like self-consciousness and planning. And so, you know, I don't think that this argument or the sort of story that they're telling is particularly controversial. I think it's probably pretty intuitive to most people who study certainly, like, you know, neuroscience, basic academic neuroscience, but probably most people who are in biomedical science more broadly. And so sort of just like there were primitive versions of you know, the eye, right? The eye, something like an eye, a visual sensory organ, has evolved many, many times completely independently. So that's just sort of like photon detectors, essentially, or light detectors. But early on in evolution, it was literally just the ability to determine changes in levels of light. So it would just be, you know, imagine if you close your eyes, you can tell when somebody's shining a light in your face, right? But you can't really see what it is. And you had, you know, sort of evolutionary iterations on that until you got something like the human eye, which is, by the way, a very messy, it's a hot mess in terms of anatomy. It's designed, or it's organized totally irrationally. But so broadly speaking, you know, I think that this, so again, so all this to say, like, I don't think that this is, you know, not making a huge splash with this argument. It's more that they're tying evolutionary history to consciousness, and in particular human consciousness, which I think is totally valid and fairly convincing. So that's what I had prepared for today, since I missed last Sunday, because I had to write this paper, and boy was it miserable. But now I will go live on the Twitters, and we can have a more effective back and forth. Sorry that the phone didn't work. I tested and everything. It should have worked. So I'm sorry about that. Can we not post? That would be very nice if we could do that. Ugh, that's irritating. Let's see if we can do this. Ugh, okay, never mind. I have to do the whole thing from the beginning. Okay. Brain scientist. Ask me anything. And by the way, on Twitter, I am _anthropoid, @_anthropoid. And you're welcome to interact. If you have any comments or questions about the things that I brought up, go live. And science, and brain. Not Brian. Right. Okay. Okay. I think we're ready. Let's get started. Oh wait, let me do this right quick. Boom. Okay. No. Okay. Here we go. Yeah. So if you'd like to call in live, just go to my Twitter, which is @_anthropoid. Let's get rid of that. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, here in sunny, beautiful Philadelphia. This past week, I was missing. I was negligent this past Sunday because I had to give birth, in a way, to what will hopefully be the last manuscript that I submit before I finish my PhD. I'm happy to get into some of the findings there. They're not particularly that shocking. Not everything didn't work out quite the way I wished, which is oftentimes the case in science. But I was basically up until like 5 a.m. on Saturday, and at 11 a.m. my wife went off out of town to a college reunion, and so that was also the first time that my wife was away from the baby for a full 24-hour cycle. So we survived, but I continued not getting very much sleep. So I figured that I should recover before I even try to interact with people in a meaningful way. Hello from Michigan. Hello, Mass Kitty. Michigan's a very beautiful state. I've had the opportunity to go there. And so I talked earlier on YouTube, I talked a bit about two things. First was a critique of HBO's Chernobyl that is made by a biomedical scientist, a researcher, physician, who had direct experience in helping to treat some of the survivors of the Chernobyl incident. And he has a lot of pretty pointed criticisms about how the way that certain things were portrayed, in particular the severity of acute radiation poisoning. Yeah, I agree. It is a good series. I totally agree. But he just highlights that they didn't get everything right, and in some cases they got things quite wrong, as well as sort of like the sustained fear-mongering of what it's like to be exposed to radiation. Hello, and Mikkel. And so that was very interesting. He ended up actually moving to Kiev, Ukraine, to sort of demonstrate to people that we need not evacuate such a wide range of people following, again, the Chernobyl incident. And so that was very interesting. His name's Robert Gale. You can check it out on YouTube if you'd like. And then I also talked about a new book that has come out that makes an argument for where the sort of the earliest precursors of consciousness, of human consciousness, and they tie it to evolutionary history, which I think is an interesting effort, and I don't think that it's particularly controversial, their claim, but there definitely be some people who disagree with them. I just downloaded this app after 3 years. I can't believe you're still going. Yeah, so long as people are interested in chatting. I'm interested in chatting. Hello from North Carolina. Hello. We think we're entitled to happiness, but we're not. Yeah, so there are some interesting arguments about whether or not, hey Diane, whether or not a life should be arranged around seeking happiness or joy versus satisfaction, which I think is an interesting conversation to have. All right, how do we make sure our brains are in right order? Well, when you say right order, I'm not 100% sure what precisely you mean. Hey, from Philly, what's up? Hello from Ukraine. Very cool. I just talked about some critiques of a show that came out in the United States. Perhaps you're aware of it, called Chernobyl on HBO. And there's a physician who had some pretty pointed criticisms about the way certain things were portrayed in that TV show. Hey, from Finland. Oh, cool. Hello from the UK. And hello from Scotland. Very cool. That's awesome. So yeah, when you say make sure our brains are in the right order, I mean, that can mean a bunch of different things. Like, how do we live a healthiest possible life to stave off the onset of things like age-associated cognitive impairment, or perhaps even dementia. Or you could also be meaning, how do we learn most efficiently? And so there are a bunch of different interpretations. Okay. That a person isn't, crazy and doesn't know it. Hello from France. Yeah, I agree. I think Chernobyl was really fun to watch, very intense. Yeah, so that a person isn't crazy and doesn't know it. So I assume that you mean, like, how can we ensure that we have not lost our minds? I assume it is what you mean. Well, one of the sort of like awful curses that is associated with psychosis is that oftentimes folks who are suffering from psychosis actually know it. They're aware that they've sort of lost the thread, but that doesn't ameliorate the severity of the psychosis. This is also true, for example, in obsessive compulsive disorder, where people will engage in the sort of these irrational rituals, like washing their hands over the, excessively, or turning on and off a light switch over and over again to avoid some kind of perceived future, malady that might befall them. And oftentimes they're aware that those rituals are totally irrational, and that, washing their hands over and over again are not going to keep their mother alive, but they still do it anyways. And so, I'm not saying, this is the most commonly the case, but oftentimes one is quite aware that they're experiencing psychosis, that reality is breaking down for them, but they can't do anything really about it. And of course, there are absolutely cases of folks who are not aware that they're experiencing delusions. But I mean, so the best thing you could do is, if you suspect that there's anything wrong, go talk to a physician, right? Get a referral, if you're in the United States, for a psychologist or psychiatrist. Certainly, if you have any concern that that's the case, even that concern, if it's impeding one's quality of life, can be a symptom of something else. And so it's worth just engaging somebody who has experience in determining whether or not there's something wrong, because it's available. Now, in terms of on your own, like I'm trained as a PhD candidate in neuroscience. We don't really study psychological evaluations, and so were I in your shoes and I was concerned about that, that's what I would go do, is talk to a therapist of some sort or a psychiatrist. But then if you're wondering, hey, do I have depression, right? I know I feel depressed, but everybody feels depressed every now and then. It's totally natural. Is what I'm feeling abnormal, or would it qualify as depression? That's a little bit more difficult to determine. And my advice to you, as just somebody who studies the nervous system, not as a physician, would be to go talk to a physician who have a very deep well of experience from which they can draw to tell you, yes, there are some opportunities here for you to improve your quality of life, and that's absolutely worth it. Okay, so psychosis or spiritual. Well, I don't really have any training in any kind of spiritual tradition, so that's not for me to say. Why is the world so depressed? Is it a new phenomenon, or just seen more because of social media? Dr. Lojas balls. I think that's a super interesting topic that I would love to see more thoroughly debated among physicians and people who sort of assess trends in social media. One of my favorite examples of this is, it's not like post-traumatic stress disorder didn't exist before we identified it and described it in the DSM-5 or DSM-4, whenever it was first included. It of course existed. My grandfather fought in World War II as a forward observer, and he, fortunately for me and the rest of his grandkids and his children, he wrote a book. And he didn't publish it or anything like that. Well, he sort of self-published it. but it was really just for us. In fact, the subtitle is A Memoir for My Grandchildren. And, the things that he saw, it was sort of like, if you've ever seen the movie Saving Private Ryan, there were definitely some experiences that were depicted in that movie that he experienced. But a lot of the people coming back from that horrible war were traumatized, but they didn't have a term for it at the time, right? They didn't have PTSD as a diagnosis. They called it shell shock. And so, how, I think it's an interesting conversation, how the description or categorization of a given psychiatric condition affects its prevalence or affects its perception, by people who don't have it. But these things regularly evolve. Like another great example is our concept of addiction is very different today than it was just a few decades ago. Early on, let's say around the Prohibition era in the United States, which is when the very short period of time when the United States government, federal government, outlawed alcohol altogether. It was illegal to have it. A whole bunch of terrible consequences emerged from that. Not the least of which a very, very wealthy black market. If you've ever heard of the name Al Capone, he sort of gained prominence through Prohibition. But at around that time, and between essentially then and like the 80s maybe, addiction was really considered to be a kind of moral failure, a kind of a spiritual or moral failure. And there still, I think, are some persistent strains of perspectives on addiction that are derived from those, right? Where people kind of look down on people who are addicted to drugs. They'll use a term like junkie, for example. But like back in that era, physicians would distinguish between people who were junkies versus people who just overindulged, right? Oftentimes wealth played a very big role in determining who was which. But even today, that's still kind of the case, right? If you just go to if you have the resources to go to rehab, oh well, you are a recovering, addict. Whereas if you unfortunately don't have those resources, and you are going to experience this very, very severe withdrawal syndrome, you're just a junkie, right? But I think actually like starting around basically the inception of the National Institute for Drug Abuse, NIDA. Addiction had then been conceived of as, under the umbrella of the brain disease model of addiction. And that still prevails today as the sort of the overarching concept of addiction. All of this to say, can we be sure that more people today are or are not depressed than were, before social media existed? I don't know that can be quantified accurately because, the criteria that were used to identify somebody who's depressed have changed. And there are more physicians or psychiatrists, therapists who are trained to recognize more of the nuances of something like depression. But, then again, I don't think that you can discount or I think it's easy to underestimate the role that social media, which is a very unique form of interaction, plays in propagating psychiatric illnesses. So the short answer is, I don't know. I suspect that there is a confluence of psychiatric, or I should say socioeconomic and political and just, social internet-based interactions that are probably amplifying depression. But I suspect that depression was far more common many, many years ago when it was diagnosed less frequently than we think of, than is familiar to us. And it was just called something else, right? Oftentimes addiction is just depression masquerading as addiction, right? People are self-medicating because they have depression. And so, it's sort of an unanswerable question. Okay. Why does PTSD cause short-term memory loss? Well, so it doesn't always, right? There are PTSD can manifest in a variety of different ways. It could be something like psychosomatic pain, for example. How could it cause PTSD, or how could it cause memory loss, or how could it be associated with memory loss, right? A way to think of any psychiatric condition, PTSD included, it's not that like the PTSD is doing something to your brain. It's that PTSD is manifesting because of certain events occurring in the brain. So, let's take a very sort of obvious example where somebody went to war, observed and experienced atrocities, and comes home, and they have to sort of reintegrate into a society that wherein those types of experiences are unusual, if ever occur. So PTSD is fundamentally a psychiatric condition that emerges from learning and memory. Your brain uses emotional experiences as a rudder for future behavior. Whether or not you engage in a given behavior is to a large degree determined by how positive or negative you expect that outcome to be of that behavior based off of your past experiences. And so PTSD, one way to think of it is sort of like this experience was so severely traumatizing that every future decision that you make ought to be informed by that experience, right? I mean, that's sort of anthropomorphizing this condition a lot, but that is one way to think of it. And so, you are essentially experiencing a unique state of consciousness, a unique brain state that implicates learning and memory. And so therefore, engaging the same system of learning and memory, it'll be under unique consequences or unique situation due to that altered state of consciousness because of that horribly traumatizing experience. But then, of course, there are things like dissociation or derealization, various very odd and difficult to imagine for somebody like me who's never experienced it, states of consciousness where people feel like they're not, like they totally dissociate. They're not taking in information. They're not unconscious, but they're not sort of like somebody's flipped down the switch off for forming memories. That can be a coping mechanism that emerges from these very severely traumatizing experiences. I've oftentimes heard this discussed among survivors of sexual trauma. There's not one. It's not like I can tell you, oh, it is the CA1 field of the dorsal hippocampus that is damaged, and therefore all people with PTSD have memory issues. It's not quite that simple. Okay. Speaking of spiritual, where do you stand on mediumship? I don't really take a stance on it. It's not something that I've trained to scrutinize. All right. So how about Trump derangement syndrome? Real thing or fake news? Well, I guess oftentimes the people who are accusing others of having Trump derangement syndrome also argue that there's a lot of fake news. No, I mean, I think a lot of the same people who would argue that folks are suffering from this Trump derangement syndrome would have previously been accused of suffering from Obama derangement syndrome, right? And so, I suspect that this is just a natural consequence of how politically polarized the United States is right now. And no, it's not like a neurological condition, right? If the universe is expanding, what is outside it? If there's nothing outside it, how does it expand? I think it's a super interesting topic, but one better brought up with a physicist, or perhaps, ideally, a cosmologist. And I know just the person. Her name is Deanna Hooper, DC Hooper. She's available on Twitter, and she studies dark matter, or dark energy. Probably both. If you study one, do you have to study the other? Yeah, DC Hooper 91. Check her out and ask her that question. I'm sure she has a very interesting answer for that. Is ADHD really ADHD? So that's a funny way to put it, but I know what you mean. Like, is ADHD a bona fide condition? Well, or is it a byproduct of overprescription, or perhaps even some sort of conspiracy that emerges from the pharmaceutical industry? It is safe to say that ADHD is among the most controversial psychiatric diagnoses. And this is for both, I think, valid, totally understandable reasons, but also some misunderstandings of what it is and the biological research underlying ADHD. And it's worth keeping in mind that it doesn't matter what any one physician or any one scientist says. The way that we come to a consensus in science is when multiple groups who aren't related to one another, multiple research groups who don't interact with one another, are studying the same phenomenon using different research methods, using different samples of a broader population, and then it takes years for all of those studies to be conducted, and then out of all of that work emerges a consensus. And so right now the consensus is yes, ADHD is a bona fide psychiatric condition. And this is, again, putting aside the conversation of whether or not way, it is over diagnosed in the United States. I think it is. And whether or not ADHD medications are overused in the United States, I think they are. We're talking about the neurophysiology here. And so there is sufficient research that identifies biological substrate, meaning a biological cause of the condition, as well as genetic research showing that it is very significantly heritable. And to indicate that, and then also genetics research identifying specific genes that when one inherits a certain form of those genes, one is much more likely to exhibit ADHD. And so we're talking about genes like the dopamine transporter, the D4 dopamine receptor, the norepinephrine transporter, and dopamine beta hydroxylase, which is the enzyme that catalyzes the synthesis of norepinephrine from dopamine. And then monoamine oxidase, the enzyme that is responsible for gobbling up all those monoamines, dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin also, by the way. And then neuropeptide Y and catechol O-methyltransferase, which is another enzyme that really is more responsible for gobbling up dopamine, particularly in the prefrontal cortex, which, by the way, gets us to the biological substrate, the putative biological substrate of ADHD, which is the mesocortical limbic dopaminergic circuit. So meso, meaning sort of midbrain, cortical limbic, meaning a connection between the limbic system and the cortex, in this case the prefrontal cortex, mesocortical limbic meaning mood associated, also motivation associated brain regions, and in particular a dopaminergic transmission within that circuit. And so is it a real thing? Whatever, that people can be born with a unique architecture to this system that results in a pretty consistent profile of behavioral, unique behaviors, and and it's variable, right? People have variable levels of severity of these symptoms. And a lot of the controversy, at least one of the sources of controversy, is, okay, where do we put the threshold for, okay, if somebody has this level of severity, you don't have ADHD. If somebody has this level of severity, you do, right? That threshold of that diagnostic threshold is what we call it, is subject to debate, and I think it's an important debate. But the idea that it totally doesn't exist because one of the pioneers of the concept of ADHD now says that he doesn't believe in it, it's not in his hands, right? It's not like you become the king of a diagnosis if you developed it, right? That's not how science works. We no longer practice eminence-based medicine. It's evidence-based medicine, and there is evidence that there's something unique about the brains of people who have certain behavioral profiles and that are associated with opportunities to help them enjoy a greater quality of life. Now, that whole conversation completely sidestepped the controversies associated with ADHD, which I think are worthy of attention, and a lot of them are almost certain. A lot of the accusations of the societal ills that have come out of overdiagnosis of ADHD, overprescription of ADHD drugs, I think is totally valid. But we're talking about the biology here. Okay. Gays not so long ago were treated as sick, indeed. Hi, Quintessential Lemon. Oh my gosh, it's been a while, I think. Psychosis and marijuana. Let's talk about that. Love it. In fact, I'm planning on putting out either a podcast, or I might actually try and pitch this to some publications. There is a writer. He's just a writer, reporter. That doesn't mean he can't talk about these things, but he's not trained in science, who has put out a book. Oh, I wish I had my notes on it. I'm reading through it now, called Tell the Kids, or Tell Your Kids. And it's basically all about the negative health consequences of marijuana, as he refers to it. Most scientists would call it cannabis, whatever. Regardless, he goes through, his name's Alex Berenson, and he goes through and he deploys what is sort of one of the most time-honored traditions of prohibitionists, which is recounting specific examples of horrible events in which cannabis is somehow associated, and he uses that as essentially the basis to suggest that cannabis is way more dangerous than we think, and the advocates of legalization are exaggerating the benefits, and etc. Now, the issue with doing that is that is not how science proceeds, right? Those are all anecdotes. Anecdotes are a form of evidence, but they are the weakest form of evidence, right? Just having a story of something that happened without any mechanistic research, no biology, right, no pharmacology, is the weakest form. It's considered the weakest form of evidence. It's not useless, but it's the weakest form. So, so to base a whole argument on, regaling readers with these atrocities, it's almost a non sequitur. It's not a non sequitur, but it's almost, right? You're almost having a conversation about something else. If we're going to talk about the potential hazards of smoking pot, then you have to talk about the biology, the actual research that has been done that determines whether or not any substance is dangerous, right? And, the short story is that out of that research, which, includes people who work at the National Institute of Drug Abuse, but certainly biomedical science more broadly, if we were to assign a level of threat to public health that we use to determine whether or not something's legal, right? There's only a couple of substances in the United States that are legal to use just recreationally. You don't need any kind of excuse. Alcohol, nicotine, tobacco, caffeine. There are a couple others that are just very, very mildly psychoactive, but those are the ones that are like explicitly legal that people talk about. If we were to, and then cannabis is as illegal as a drug can be. If we were to apply that legality that we apply to cannabis to any of those other drugs, a massively greater number of them would be illegal. Alcohol would absolutely be illegal. Tens of thousands of people die every single year due to preventable death, alcohol-induced preventable death. That number for cannabis is debatable, but it's very, very close to zero. And so now, all of that said, are there some potential hazards associated with cannabis? Absolutely. There's no question. There absolutely are. So, for example, we can predict genetically whether or not somebody is potentially vulnerable to experiencing psychosis and potentially even schizophrenia after being exposed to cannabis. That is a very real dynamic that's been demonstrated in science. Hey, what's up, Grace? And, we could even talk about the specific mutations. But suffice it to say, this is a small minority of the population, but they're a real population, a real sample of the population that ought to know that, yes, this is a risky substance for some people, and I might be one of those people. It's tough for you to know if you are one of those people. One of the best things you can sort of deploy in lieu of actual genetic evaluations is whether or not you have a family history of psychosis, schizophrenia, depression, bipolar disorder, those psychiatric conditions that can be associated with psychosis. And if you do, then it's probably worth your while to avoid using cannabis. By the way, it's probably also worth your while to avoid using mood-altering substances altogether, because while cannabis does seem to be associated with the greatest risk of, conversion from just run-of-the-mill psychosis or like a panic attack or an anxiety attack to a more chronic condition, cannabis seems to be the highest that's associated with that. Other drugs do too, right? Alcohol certainly included, definitely amphetamine. So, I think that there is this resurgence of fear-mongering surrounding cannabis because guess what? There's an opportunity there. You can make money doing that because cannabis is being legalized at the state level, at a rate that's unprecedented. And we're almost certainly going to observe the legalization of cannabis at the federal level. And there is a new opportunity for people to say, to get people upset, get people afraid, get people angry at this, because it is true. There is a seed of truth to the argument that there are, potential issues that people can experience, potential psychiatric conditions that people can develop after being exposed to cannabis. But that is not the point, right? We know that there are absolutely a predictable number of people who will develop a debilitating addiction to oxycodone, or a debilitating addiction to alcoholism, or to alcohol. But we have determined that you can have a prescription and have an opioid. Even fentanyl, even sufentanil, even more potent opioid than fentanyl. Same with alcohol. So, okay. Will crowding be banned at the federal level, in your opinion? Well, Dr. Lojas, yeah, it's a really interesting topic. It's something that I find to be an important demonstration of the rationality at the root of our approach to drug laws in this country. So kratom, for anybody that's not familiar, is a tree that is native to Southeast Asia but grows all over the place now, inside the leaves of which some opioid alkaloids are produced. Opioid. It's not related at all to the opium poppy, which is what produces morphine and the thebaine alkaloids that then can be converted into something like oxycodone. They are opioid because they seem to be able to bind opioid receptors in our brain, the same opioid receptors that morphine will bind or hydrocodone and Vicodin will bind. However, it doesn't seem to be remotely as potent as any of the opioids I just named. But there is, and again, just like I said for the anecdotes about cannabis, there are anecdotes of people who were addicted to heroin or oxycodone or Vicodin, hydrocodone, who were able to kick their habit by using kratom, because it mitigated the severity of their withdrawal syndrome, which is one of the preeminent reasons that people are, fail to quit. But then also we're able to live stable lives, akin to people who undergo treatment with methadone or treatment with Suboxone. Now, methadone notoriously is extraordinarily difficult to stop taking, just because of the nature, because of the properties of the interaction of the methadone molecule with the mu opioid receptor. It binds it really tight and it stays bound for a long time. So there's a trade-off to treating opioid addiction with methadone. Kratom, the withdrawal syndrome doesn't seem to be nearly as severe, and again, it can help people to kick their habits. And in an age where an unprecedented number of people are dying from opioid overdose, in Philadelphia, by the way, but all throughout the country, the idea that the FDA would put out a statement, this is put out by Scott Gottlieb, he was the commissioner, he recently stepped down, saying that kratom needs to be emergency scheduled, which, by the way, uses laws that were created in something called the RAVE Act, of which Joe Biden was the author, by the way. Just an interesting little historical tidbit. Different time in the country, but the RAVE Act was written because of the MDMA, surge in popularity of MDMA, which is why they called it the RAVE Act. But in any case, the idea that the FDA would move to emergency schedule kratom, despite the fact that in that statement that they put out, now this isn't the one that Scott Gottlieb put out. Well, let's continue on that. So Scott Gottlieb puts out this statement saying that kratom has been associated with, something like 42 fatalities associated with 42 fatalities. Okay, well, that's tragic. Certainly if something is able, it's not like a ton of people use that stuff. Maybe if more people were exposed, more people would die. The issue, though, is that in that statement, they said that they could not attribute any one of them to kratom alone. Other substances were being used. And so, that in and of itself is sort of like, okay, well, then how do we know that kratom is the thing that hurt these people? Or maybe it's an interaction between kratom and another drug, right? And again, given the fact that people are using this plant to transition off of addiction to dangerous opioids, dangerously addictive, dangerously potent opioids, then the idea that you're going to prohibit access to those, to kratom, and only allow people to continue their current use of illicit opioids or of highly potent opioids, you are definitely that's definitely going to result in greater numbers of fatalities. Now, here's why I like to focus in on this statement by former Commissioner of the FDA, Scott Gottlieb. It's because I think 2 weeks later, or 2 weeks before, put out a statement saying that sufentanil, an opioid that's even more potent than fentanyl, so fentanyl is almost single-handedly responsible for this dramatic uptick in the rates of opioid overdoses, fatalities. It's also arguably almost single-handedly responsible for reducing the life expectancy in the United States, fentanyl. Now the FDA is going to approve the use of sufentanil, which is even more potent. At the same, essentially simultaneously outlawing kratom, which has not been associated with essentially any fatality, at least alone. Now, the legalization of sufentanil will absolutely predictably cause an increase in the number of fatalities, right? Just imagine what fentanyl does today. Partly because fentanyl is so profitable on the streets, you need such a little amount of it to yield hundreds of doses, thousands of doses. Sufentanil even more potent. So now, do I think that kratom is going to be rendered illegal? I don't know. It's tough to predict these types of things these days. I know that this era of trying to illegalize or prohibit kratom, this is not the first time. This happened several years ago during the Obama administration. And Orrin Hatch, I believe former senator from Utah, stepped in and prevented the DEA from doing that, saying we need a period of public comment, and then they never proceeded. So I don't really know. I think a lot of it depends upon who is the driving force behind trying to get kratom prohibited. It's impossible for me to know who that is. It would be very interesting to know. But I do know that the last time this happened, there was a very substantial public outcry. And it was a bipartisan decision to decide to not allow it to be emergency scheduled. So I don't know. It's interesting. I think it will be an interesting case study of how the FDA makes these determinations. So that was a long tirade. Sorry about that. All right. How does the slight difference in the molecular structures of CBD and THC alter their effects? Really interesting topic, Grace. So I'm sure most people, or maybe some people, recognize the initialism of THC, that is tetrahydrocannabinol, the sort of primary ingredient or active agent of cannabis or pot or weed or whatever you call it. Skunk, I believe, is the preferred terminology in the UK. So that's tetrahydrocannabinol. It is considered to be the molecule that's responsible for the majority of the psychoactive properties of cannabis. In other words, the thing that actually gets you high, or gets you silly, gets you giggling, potentially gives you the munchies. And CBD, cannabidiol, is also a cannabinoid. It also does bind cannabinoid receptors, similarly to the way that THC binds. But because, as Grace is identifying, there are some slight molecular differences, they bind different receptors with different affinities. So THC tends to be associated with the CB1 receptor, which is far more numerous in the central nervous system, which makes sense because it is within the central nervous system that any psychoactive would exert its effects. In other words, you can't have a psychoactive that has no effects in the central nervous system. And then CB2 receptor is the one with which CBD is most associated, and that is more densely. They're both in both, but CB2 is more densely expressed in the peripheral nervous system, and so as a result, because of those slight molecular differences, and I don't know them off the top of my head, but they will be minor. You get slightly different binding preferences, let's say, for these molecules, and because of the differences in distribution of the receptors, again, more in the central nervous system or more in the peripheral nervous system, you get slightly different effects, because something that regulates a peripheral nervous system function won't have as severe as a psychoactive effect, right? It doesn't mean that it will have zero psychoactive effect, but it'll be mostly sort of indirect, right? And that is perhaps part of the explanation for why people find CBD effective for things like muscle tension. In some cases, some folks find it effective for pain, whereas THC is more the sort of recreationally preferred molecule. And so, yeah, actually, what's funny is I was planning a while ago, maybe I'll still do it. So CBD was legalized for just like sale in Philadelphia, actually not that recently, but a while ago. And, so I can just go get it. So I was planning on just doing a live stream after having taken some CBD. But I don't know, maybe I should like test it out before I do that. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly safe to say that the effects of CBD, of course, dose probably plays a very substantial role in determining this, but the effects of CBD are very mild, particularly relative to THC. But really interesting topic. What's up, Zaina? Good to see you. DMT, there's a lot to talk about when it comes to DMT. All right. Take it on camera. Great minds. Yeah, right. How long does post-concussion syndrome last? Oh, somebody's trying to call in. Okay. Ooh, it's an interesting profile picture. All right. PTSD after this, or I'm sorry, post-concussive syndrome after this. But first, what's your name and where are you calling from?
Good afternoon. This is Denver Sky on Twitter. My name is Michael. I'm calling from Morrison, Colorado. You speak very fast, young man. I've been accused of that myself, having matriculated law school and now working in the intelligence community at 51.
Well, yeah, it's funny. I thought I spoke pretty slowly, but I grew up in Miami, which is populated densely with Cubans, as well as now here. And I work with a lot of people from New Jersey, and I'm like a snail compared to them. But yeah, I've been accused of that before.
So people don't want to talk about marijuana, and that's fine. I think it's we're beating a dead horse. Everybody knows it should be legal. But anyway, I think that's probably a good thing. I just happened to stumble into the room, and I noticed you seem like a very intelligent guy. And I posted in the text down there, I said, what about melatonin and the melatonin crop circle that appeared 48 hours after the Scandinavian knife attack?
Melatonin?
Melatonin is a...
No, so I'm sorry, I should say, Michael, I know what melatonin is. We can talk about melatonin.
It's central to the production of all the other neurotransmitters in the brain.
Well, not quite. So melatonin is a neurotransmitter that's largely produced within the pineal body, and it is important for the regulation of the circadian rhythm. But I've never heard of this connection with a sort of crop circle.
So you're saying melatonin, and you're saying the pituitary gland, melatonin, and the adrenal cortex are not interrelated endocrine functions. Is that what you're telling me?
No, not the pituitary, the pineal gland. So the pineal gland is the host.
What I'm trying to get from you is the fact that you're not the only person that understands the brain and has knowledge about it. I have a bachelor's degree in psychology. I know the brain pretty well too. My point is that you're underestimating the fact that you know so much, and melatonin actually has far greater critical significance to the function of the neurotransmitter production in the hypothalamus than the pituitary gland itself. But the pituitary gland and melatonin are integrally linked in the sleep cycle. The pituitary gland releases a very small amount of melatonin when alpha wave sleep becomes present.
Okay, so Michael, I should say, Michael,
You're so arrogant, buddy. I got news for you. The intelligent ones above your head don't see.
Listen, Michael, I don't think I'm any smarter than any one of you.
So why don't you just slow the fuck down, and why don't you take a little hint here? When somebody comes in that's smarter than you, you might be able to recognize it, smart ass.
Michael, I'm
You're a jerk, pal.
Wow, you didn't even let me say it. I don't think I'm any smarter than anybody in here. I say, whenever somebody tries to say I'm so smart, or I'm not. I promise you, never in my life have I had any indication to suggest that I am any smarter than any average person. I just so happen to have devoted my life to studying the brain. And when Michael, again from Colorado, was honing in on melatonin being responsible for the synthesis of all these other neurotransmitters, it's just not the case. That is not the relationship that signaling relationship that melatonin has with really any other neurotransmitter. Structurally, it's comparable to serotonin. And it's not really produced in the pituitary, it's the pineal gland. But you're absolutely right, Michael, that it does play a very important regulatory role in training the circadian rhythm. I was frankly very interested to hear what you had to say about its relationship with the stabbing incident in Scandinavia. I believe you said Sweden. I could be, or Norway. But Mike, I apologize if I led you to believe that I think I'm any smarter than you. I assure you that I don't feel that way, and I genuinely don't. I am regularly humbled by the people with whom I work, who are certainly more intelligent than I am, and I sincerely don't mean to imply that I'm any smarter than anybody in here. Okay. What came first, the egg or the chicken? That is an awesome topic, Alex. Believe it or not, there is an answer to that question. So, long time no see. Hey, what's up, Jane? Good to see you. What do people think? Do you think that it was the egg or the chicken that came first? This is oftentimes used as a sort of paradox, right? It's impossible to know. And there is an answer. Okay, so somebody's saying egg. I'm sort of curious if okay, getting two eggs. Oh well, aussi nil. Yeah, I don't think I'm allowed to. Okay, Nancy says chicken. Chicken because of evolution. Interesting. I love the way you're thinking about it. I'm not saying anything. A chicken can't just evolve. Excellent point. So I'll just get to it. And by the way, the girls are home, so if you hear any lovely little sounds like a baby, it's not like just some random baby that's in my apartment. It is my baby. Okay, so if you think so, somebody said, I think Nas said, a chicken can't just evolve. That is correct. A chicken would have to hatch from something that was laid by something that probably looked a lot like a chicken, but wasn't technically a chicken. And so, yes, it is the egg that came first that gave rise, or that inside of which all the mutations occurred that would then give rise to a chicken that then would start laying more eggs to make more chickens. So awesome topic. I love it. And I love that people sort of instinctively turn to evolutionary biology to evaluate that topic. I love it. So well done, guys. Okay. Okay, we have some more callers. Very cool. So having a call from Miguel, I believe is your name. Miguel, where are you calling from?
Hello.
Miguel, are you there?
Yeah, from Colombia, South America.
Oh, cool. Miguel from Colombia. So what's on your mind?
Yes.
All good, brother. Just want to say hello to you. I remember that, like, first time that I was watching you, you always say, like, Miguel, hello, Miguel Herrera, Miguel Herrera.
Miguel, yeah. I was trying to do the right pronunciation, but yeah, I should probably not even try, right?
No, you have the good Spanish. Are you able to speak it?
Not fluently, no. I just, I took Spanish classes when I was in Miami, and you didn't get the answer right unless you pronounced it properly. But I never developed fluency, unfortunately. I like to pretend like I'm fluent, but I'm not.
Yeah. Thanks for taking my call, dude. You are very, very, very smart. I've been learning a lot from you since I found you, probably like around 2 years ago. And I always try to watch you live, and when I can't watch you live, I always watch your replay. And yeah, like, it's really fun to watch you because you just learn a lot by hearing you,
I really appreciate it, Miguel. Thanks for calling in, man. And thanks, I really appreciate hearing that. But again, I just have to emphasize, I am not smarter than anybody else. I just happen to have the privilege of getting to study something that not everybody gets to study. But anyways, Miguel, thanks so much again for calling in, and I look forward to talking to you again.
Of course, brother. I also download your podcast.
Oh, cool. Yeah. So
Wired to be weird, or like.
Yep.
What's the name?
Yeah, Wired to be Weird. You're absolutely right.
Wired to be Weird, yeah. And I listened to that. It was also fun. Let me ask you just one question before saying goodbye. Like, maybe this is out of your topic right now, but like, what do you think about that discovery today? They found like this huge piece of metal inside of the moon.
Oh, I haven't heard of that. I'll have to check it out. Yeah, it's I usually don't.
Let me tell you very fast, like.
Yeah.
Alright, like, they found a huge piece of metal, almost like 5 times the size, like almost like 5 times Hawaii, the big island of Hawaii, almost 5 times that side. They found it of the dark side of the moon, the side that we cannot see from Earth. So they found that like 200 kilometers inside, like buried there,
That's wild. Yeah, I'll have to check it out. It sounds super interesting.
Yeah. All right, brother. Thank you very much. Have a good one, man. See you around definitely.
Thanks again. Likewise. Oops. Miguel, desde Colombia. Oops. Man, okay. Can you answer my question? Sorry, Robert. Okay. Robert, let's see. I kill myself in my dreams to wake up from a nightmare. What does that mean? Answer, please. So, Robert, it sounds like you're pretty distressed by this. And I am not trained in psychology or as a therapist. I would recommend that you just go reach out to a therapist. I just from the perspective of somebody who studies the neurophysiology of the brain and central nervous system, I wouldn't put too much stock into the importance of dreams. We can talk about some of the neurophysiology of dreams, why we have dreams, what can influence them, and how some people can have lucid dreams. In fact, as Miguel was nice enough to bring up my podcast, I talked about dreams quite a bit. Podcast is called Wired to be Weird, and it's on iTunes and Stitcher and Spotify and a bunch of other places, Anchor. But suffice it to say, the short story is that dreams are not like this revelation of your actual true self, or the sort of the manifestation of your subconscious, more authentic desires. That's just not an accurate depiction of what dreams are based off of the substrate of dreams. So yeah, when I should say thank you very much for the super hearts, Alicia, I recognize you there, and Dennis, I really appreciate it, man. Oh, and somebody's trying to call in. Oh, cool, and so a fan of the Grateful Dead, I assume. So Miles, I assume is your name. Where are you calling from?
Hey, I'm calling from Virginia, east coast of the United States.
Right on. I love Virginia. Virginia's gorgeous. But anyway, so what's on your mind?
So, kind of keeping with the topic, I have kind of a neurochemistry question to ask you. So, the pineal gland, I hear from different podcasts and things that when you die, it actually releases dimethyltryptamine, otherwise known as DMT, into your brain. And do you think that has any connection with people that have these kind of heavenly experiences when they have near-death experiences?
Right, yeah. So yeah, just sort of rephrase this. There is this concept that from the pineal gland, or the pineal gland, some people say, or pineal body, which is a very small part of the brain. It's sort of kind of towards it's underneath the cortex, and it's pretty small, very evolutionarily ancient. A lot of very simple animals have a pineal gland. There was this argument made by, it is, I should say, also the source of the majority of melatonin in the brain. But this book was written called The Spirit Molecule several decades ago by a guy named Rick Strassman, Dr. Rick Strassman. And he had a bunch of theories about what the role of the pineal gland might be and the relationship between the pineal gland and DMT, dimethyltryptamine. And so the short story is that there is no evidence to suggest that DMT is ever released at high concentrations or at, let's say, just non-trivial concentrations, right? Let's say, not anywhere close to something like dopamine or serotonin or norepinephrine or, the other neurotransmitters with which you might be familiar. There's just no evidence to suggest it ever reaches those concentrations. And therefore, there's no evidence to suggest that it plays any kind of regulatory role whatsoever. Now, there is evidence. I think somebody who is an advocate of the sort of the Rick Strassman model would say, but there have been studies that have detected levels of DMT in brain tissue, and that's true. But they've only ever detected trace levels. So again, these are very, very, very low levels, and frankly, they're at levels. And this is my own speculation here. This couldn't be proven given the evidence we have available. DMT is very molecularly similar to serotonin. And there are the enzymes present within the brain that would convert serotonin to DMT or DMT to serotonin. But again, none of that forms enough evidence to suggest that it plays a significant role at all in consciousness. And so when it comes to dreams or near-death experiences, as Miles, you're bringing up, we can explain even the strangest of those experiences with neurophysiology independently of DMT. We don't need a psychedelic to explain having very strange and exotic experiences just with our own run-of-the-mill, nervous system. So have you ever heard somebody, Miles, I'm just curious, have you ever heard and I have heard this on a variety of other podcasts too, so I don't mean that this is a totally wacky thing to be talking about, but have you ever heard somebody suggest what I just said, that DMT is actually, some of the studies that I just highlighted, or are they only talking about DMT, near-death experiences and dreams?
No. I've heard both sides,
okay.
Of course. I tend to kind of agree with the side that I mentioned, just based on personal experiences with DMT and things like that. But I was just picking your brain, seeing what you thought about it.
No, man, it's super interesting. And so, let's just, I don't mean to infer too much about what you just said, but if you take any psychedelic, LSD, mescaline, 2CI, whatever you might be exposed to, keep in mind that those molecules, they can obviously cause some amazing changes in states of consciousness and give you access to emotional states, cognitive states, obviously sensory experiences that would be completely impossible were it not for the presence of those drugs. But it is still the same brain. It's just the brain is now handling information in a perturbed way, right? The molecule is changing the way that the serotonin signaling system mostly is handling information. And so, when somebody's just had a near-death experience, important to note, near-death, right? They're not actually dead. That is a unique state of consciousness, right? And various changes are occurring at the level of the brain that will alter the way the brain is handling information. Same goes for dreams. That is a unique brain state. And I talked about it on the podcast, Wired to be Weird, iTunes and Stitcher. We can explain a lot about the odd and exotic, surprising nature of dreams without there having to be any kind of psychedelic molecule to explain them. But anyways, Miles, did you have anything else on your mind, or were you mostly interested in that topic?
No, that was pretty much it, and I thank you for having me on, and thanks for your time.
It's my pleasure. I find the topic very interesting. Thanks for calling, Miles.
All right, have a good one.
Oops, sorry, that was a little too early. Still learning my sort of reflexes with this system. But, okay, hey, what's up, Marcus? Marcus Aurelius. Modafinil, what are your thoughts on it? Modafinil is an interesting molecule. It was initially marketed as a thumpers. What's up? Initially marketed as a non-habit forming alternative to the classic psychomotor stimulants like, amphetamine and Adderall, or methylphenidate and Ritalin and Concerta. And again, non-habit forming because it didn't seem to be as rewarding as those other psychomotor stimulants, like amphetamine. And studies showed that it did indeed increase alertness and gave people the sense that they had energy. So it was a stimulant, but it didn't seem to be functioning in the same way. Subsequent studies have shown that actually no, modafinil, which is Provigil for anybody that's not familiar, does indeed engage some of the same systems that amphetamine or methylphenidate engage, the catecholamine signaling system, dopamine, norepinephrine, just not quite as effectively or not quite as potently as amphetamine or methylphenidate do. So, and also interestingly, modafinil has sort of evolved to occupy this kind of nootropic. It's become popular among people who are interested in nootropics. And so it's sometimes conceived of as like a legal or a real version of NZT, which is the fictional drug in Limitless. And no studies suggest that it amplifies cognition in any way remotely close to what NZT, that fictional drug, does. And in fact, some studies show that it actually increased reaction time when somebody was like in a fighter pilot sort of situation where you need to you don't do ninja. I don't know why I just did that, but you need to respond quickly. But and so it made them respond less quickly. And so, just because something makes you feel better or give you more energy doesn't mean that they're actually increasing your cognitive performance. So that's my feeling. I mean, it's also used as a treatment for narcolepsy, which makes sense. But I think that there's a lot of exaggeration around modafinil because of its early marketing, and a lot of that is just an exaggeration, just inaccurate. What are your thoughts on phenibut? Phenibut's an interesting molecule. So phenibut is it's an odd word, but essentially it's a modification of the GABA molecule, and it's kind of similar to another drug called baclofen, in that they both act as just sort of GABA receptor agonists. It's sort of like the molecule that can masquerade as GABA. GABA itself, if you just eat GABA, is not going to pass your blood-brain barrier, not going to get into your brain. All of the GABA in your brain is synthesized within the brain. And so, but baclofen or phenibut are capable of crossing the blood-brain barrier and then do engage GABA receptors. And so phenibut's an odd drug because it's not like a benzodiazepine that tend like Xanax or alprazolam or diazepam, Valium, or Klonopin. Those are positive allosteric modulators. So essentially they turn GABA A receptors, they turn up the sensitivity a little bit. They turn them up to 11 so that whenever GABA itself binds those receptors, the receptor responds even more. And they tend to act more on the GABA A receptor. There are multiple kinds of GABA receptors. And phenibut, baclofen, these drugs tend to not exhibit that kind of preference for the GABA A receptor. And so as a result, you get these odd effects, right? Where some people find phenibut at certain doses stimulating. Some people find it sedating at all doses. And it can be anxiolytic. It can reduce anxiety, which can be, very useful for some people. The problem, however, is that just like every other GABAergic sedative, it's very rapidly habit forming. And so people can develop a tolerance and a dependence upon phenibut very rapidly. And before they know it, they need to be taking phenibut to avoid a withdrawal syndrome that can be rather severe, potentially life-threatening. I'm not sure that the potential seizure activity, the reduced seizure threshold induced by a lot of these GABAergic drugs has been evaluated for phenibut, but suffice it to say that just like baclofen or just like any other GABA receptor agonist, you're going to get a potentially threatening, hazardous habit-forming effect. So yeah. But it is interesting. I believe it's actually used with a prescription in some of like the Eastern European countries, and I believe also Russia. But that might be outdated. That was the case several years ago. So would you need a sedative with that in order to avoid a brain seizure? Would you need a sedative? So I'm talking about like seizures that arise because somebody has been taking phenibut for a long period of time and then they stop. And then as a result, because the brain has become accustomed to and undergone neuroplastic adaptation as a result of phenibut, there is insufficient inhibition within the brain. And so excitation more easily drives towards seizure. And then, so a frontline treatment for a seizure when somebody comes into a hospital is a benzodiazepine. Oh, somebody was calling in and I missed it. Sorry about that. All right. Money Magul, if you want to call back in. Okay, is sertraline bad medicine? So I assume you're referring to sertraline, which I always forget if it's. I always confuse sertraline with quetiapine. I believe they're actually very, very similar. But I'm not gonna just try and remember. No, it's not a bad medication. So I'm almost certain that it is an atypical antipsychotic, and it has a sort of a variety of disparate pharmacological targets, right? It doesn't just elevate serotonin levels as does like Prozac or fluoxetine or most of the SSRIs, most of the antidepressants. It binds like a variety of different receptors, histamine receptors and like adrenergic receptors and serotonin receptors. And so as a result, it has a whole variety of effects, many of which are side effects. And in some cases, I believe sertraline is used to treat insomnia because it has one of these side effects. No. Yes, I'm confusing quetiapine with sertraline. Sertraline is just Zoloft. Sertraline is just an SSRI. So is it a bad medication? No, it's just like an alternative to Prozac or fluoxetine, they're not as effective as we would like for the treatment of depression, but they're more effective than nothing for a lot of people and can make the difference between suicidal ideation and dealing with, treating, and managing a depression. So no, I mean, it's not bad. It's not as good as perhaps we would like. What are your thoughts on herbs that work on the brain? I think they're interesting and useful in many cases, and we can learn a lot. I feel frustrated. I'm sorry about that, Psychic Trump. Are you a Trump that is psychic? Very cool. So when you say herbs that have effects on the brain, are you referring specifically to cannabis, or are you referring to just anything that has effects on the brain? I mean, there's a lot of plants that have psychoactive properties, and I don't think that anything just having psychoactive properties relegates any herb to being good or bad. Some of them are potentially dangerous, some of them are potentially useful. Oh, ashwagandha. I haven't looked at research into ashwagandha for a very long time, but the last I remember, the pharmacology. So ashwagandha is one of these herbs, supplements, some might call it, that has been used by a sort of a subculture for a while. I believe some people say that it can amplify dreams. I think some people say it's calming. But the reason I'm struggling to remember specifically is because I don't remember there ever being any research that identifies the pharmacology of ashwagandha. So mucuna that's completely different. So mucuna I believe, has a fairly high level of L-DOPA in it. And it has been used actually by the bodybuilder community, by people who don't want to use steroids, but it's been used by the bodybuilder community because it will induce a small increase in the release of androgens. And so, it's like, it's oftentimes put into this category of supplements that are called secretagogues. They induce the endogenous secretion of a hormone. And so this is all terminology used by like the supplement industry or by the bodybuilder community. But yeah, I mean, none of these are bad necessarily. It's just that we don't, there's not the depth of research into their potential long-term effects or even their short-term effects, and whether or not some people might be vulnerable for certain toxicities. Like, for example, if you've donated a kidney, let's say, and a dose that would be unproblematic in somebody with both functioning kidneys might be problematic with somebody with one kidney. Or if you have some kind of liver toxicity, you have cirrhosis, or all of these different things. You have diabetes. It could be the case that some of these herbs might increase the release of insulin or reduce the release of insulin, or whatever. All of these various things might be hepatotoxic at certain levels in somebody who has some sort of a GI issue. So that's my perspective. I mean, I don't think that they're bad or good. I think we can learn a lot about our own human biology by studying them. Okay, let's talk about cheese in discretagogues. I'm a big fan of cheese, not gonna lie. Okay, let's talk about chocolate and migraines. We can talk about that if you'd like. Nutmeg. Nutmeg's an interesting herb. Yeah, technically an herb. At very, very high doses, nutmeg can induce hallucination. But I believe the hallucinatory effects of very large amounts of nutmeg last for something like 48 hours or some insanely long period of time. I remember when I was really young, I would like read about people's like experiences with, experimenting with this stuff. And I remember like they were saying like it's taking forever to have an effect. And then like they're just like gone for like several hours. And then they come back and they're like, that was awful. I'm never going to do that again. People also experiment that way with, what is it called? Catnip. But in any case, not something I would recommend. My ears start ringing, but when I swallow it goes away. Anything serious? Excuse me. That is the kind of thing that I would certainly bring up with a physician. It could be completely benign and just a quirk of your own neurophysiology, or it could be like something pressing on nervous system projections. So it's just the kind of thing I would definitely bring up. I'm sure they would recommend something. Well, who knows? But yeah, bring up with your physician next time you're in there. Clonazepam, thoughts. Well, thoughts on clonazepam are far less effective than thoughts in the absence of clonazepam, and that is because clonazepam, or Klonopin, is a benzodiazepine that is a positive allosteric modulator. That's a technical term for what they are. They're not truly a GABA agonist, GABA A agonist, but they amplify the reaction of GABA receptors to the binding of GABA. And so, as a result, because of what GABA does, if anybody's familiar with the basic neurotransmitters of the brain, GABA, synthesized from glutamate, is the sort of the other side of a tug of war in terms of like whether or not a neuron is going to fire up an action potential or an impulse. Now, glutamate, well, let's see, glutamate will tend to pull towards excitation, will tend to push a neuron to be more likely to fire an impulse, whereas GABA makes it more and more difficult for that impulse to occur. And if anybody's interested in talking about let's say neurophysiology, the electrophysiology behind that, it's a very interesting dynamic. But suffice it to say, again, I'm overusing that phrase, but they are sort of at odds with one another. And what clonazepam does, much like any other benzodiazepines like alprazolam or mitrazolam, they make it more difficult for neurons in general to fire impulses. And as a result, at low doses, they can be anxiolytic. They can reduce activities in certain parts of the brain that promote anxiety, and thereby relieving people of anxiety. But as you escalate the doses, more and more neurons find it difficult to fire impulses, and therefore you get locomotor disruptions, you get balance and coordination issues, you get poor impulse control, right, where people will act out almost as though they're drunk. And then at very, very high doses, particularly when combined with other sedatives or opioids, they can induce respiratory failure. So, I believe clonazepam is oftentimes used in a certain form, I think sublingually, because it can have an effect very rapidly, and it doesn't last quite as long as something like Valium or diazepam. And if anybody knows why diazepam has such a very long duration of effects, 10,000 points to Gryffindor. Anyways, this is why people need to be petered off of SSRIs. Indeed, yeah, some pretty bad or unpleasant side effects can occur. If you just stop taking an SSRI, all of a sudden. Do genetic factors make people smarter than others? Nah, it's very interesting, very spicy topic, very controversial topic. So, the relationship between, first of all, just the brain and intelligence is a fraught one. At least the research of that relationship is fraught. And that is because it sort of navigates an area that sort of butts up against something called biological essentialism. And this is something that we talked about on my podcast called Wired to be Weird on iTunes and Stitcher. In particular, we talked about the heritability of political ideology. Some people seem to inherit a predisposition to finding certain things disgusting, or prioritizing certain things like empathy over power. And I am oversimplifying this dramatically. I do not oversimplify this on the podcast called Wired to be Weird on iTunes and Stitcher. It's a very interesting, very controversial body of literature. But all this said, intelligence research is actually an older discipline than modern neuroscience. People have been studying intelligence for a very long time, and it really emerged out of psychology, not out of neuroscience. Now, of course, neuroscience, certain disciplines within neuroscience are interested in studying intelligence, in particular, like neurogenetics. And if you're interested in doing some of your own research in this, I suggest you read two people. One is more of a neuroscientist and geneticist named Elliot Tucker Drob. I think he's the most articulate on this issue. And by the way, he was advised by a very prominent intelligence researcher named Eric Turkheimer, and Joseph L. Graves, who is more of a geneticist. But they both, I think, offer different strengths. And these are prominent scientists, right? I mean, they've been invited to the University of Pennsylvania to give talks, which is why I know about them. But they have different strengths. I think Joseph L. Graves gives a very useful historical context of the genetics that underlie, evolutionary context, I should say, of the genetics that underlie different genetics among different groups of people. And then Elliot Tucker Drob is very well trained in scientific statistics, as well as sort of like economics. And so he's able to ask questions in a far more nuanced way than a lot of just straight up neuroscientists or straight up geneticists do. So once again, that's Elliot Tucker Drob and Joseph L. Graves. Check them out. But so, okay. The topic is, are certain genes associated with greater intelligence? So I mean, the short answer would be probably yes. The reason that probably is doing so much work in that reaction is that intelligence, just like almost every aspect of human consciousness, is a byproduct of a gene-environment interaction, meaning that it's not like somebody expresses genes in a vacuum, right? Certain genes are become advantageous or disadvantageous, or become sort of important in consciousness or less important in consciousness in different environmental contexts, in social contexts in particular, right? So, you know, I always use this example because it's perhaps the most intuitive, but Albert Einstein, a genius, right? An incontrovertible genius. He, some argue, had a unique brain architecture that certainly arose from a unique genetic landscape that he inherited. And this perhaps enabled him to engage and manage certain kinds of information in unique ways, perhaps even see the universe in a unique way, due to this, at least in part, unique brain architecture. But it's not like Albert Einstein grew up in a vacuum, right? He grew up in a certain socioeconomic circumstance, and Austria, I believe. And therefore, and so what about nurture? Exactly. And so therefore, there was a unique repertoire of factors that influenced his development. So he learned mathematics. He learned, some physics, I guess. He learned a certain language. He learned, he was sculpted by certain environmental factors. He had certain experiences. I mean, it was around the time of World War II, right? And so it's just a very, very unique circumstance that gave rise, circumstance both nurture and nature, that gave rise to somebody like Albert Einstein. If you took that genetic profile of him, let's say you cloned him, and then you went back in your time machine, and you went back 500 years, and you put him in the middle of the bush in Australia, you probably wouldn't get the theory of relativity, right? There is a gene-environment interaction that arises, and that is a critical factor when you're evaluating the relationship between biology and intelligence. There is a relationship there. We don't know enough of the biology to, due to modern neuroscience is still a sort of nascent field, frankly. We're still learning a lot about the brain. We know a lot about the brain. We know way more than a lot of people try and argue that we know. People will say something like, we have no idea how the brain works. False. But there's still stuff yet to learn. And some of that knowledge will help us to connect the dots more distinctly, to enumerate all of the connections, relationships between biology, neuroscience, genetics, and intelligence. But suffice it to say that what is a more important consideration for our purposes here is the gene-environment interaction. Okay. There are people who came out of poverty to have fame and fortune. Is that IQ? So not necessarily, right? I mean, this is it's almost a frustratingly unsatisfying conversation to have, right? Because one could make the argument that it is the experiences of moving, of growing up in an impoverished circumstance, being exposed to the realities of poverty, that sculpts a person to be able to develop some kind of success. And by the way, success in one field doesn't mean that you're, broadly speaking, very intelligent, right? being the guy, I think it was a guy who invented the paperclip, I don't know that I would call that guy a genius. But hey, it was a very important business, a successful business move. But I don't know that I'd put him in the same category as Albert Einstein. But also, I should say, there are plenty of studies that show that there is a deleterious effect of growing up in poverty, right? So, I wouldn't put my money on somebody growing up in poverty, realizing an advantage out of that. It just happens sometimes. Ian, why do you hate paperclip? I actually don't like paperclips. They don't secure the papers. Just staple it. Like, very frustrating. What are your thoughts on panpsychism? Also, how's the family? Marcus Aurelius. Now, first of all, the family's doing great. Thank you very much. This past weekend, my wife went to a college reunion. First time that she was away for a full 24-hour cycle with me and the baby. Suffice to say, we survived. But my sleep took a hit, which is why I did not go live on Sunday. And but everything went okay. And they're doing great. They're conversing with one another sub-audibly, I believe, in an adjacent room. So, if you'll permit me to speculate as to why you're bringing up panpsychism, have you recently read some of the reviews of a book called The Evolution of the Sensitive Self by, of course, I'm forgetting the authors. I talked a little bit about this on the, Well Done. Oh, no, well, yeah, probably about the family thing. Yeah, I talked a little bit about it on the YouTube. It's an interesting book about the emergence of consciousness, tying it to evolutionary history. I'm just curious because some of the reviews of the book talked about panpsychism. Well, you let me know if that's why you're bringing this up. Panpsychism, for anybody that's not familiar, is a concept of consciousness that posits that there is a level of consciousness to everything, even atoms, right? So a dog has consciousness. Reminds me of some of Freud's thoughts. I'm not an expert in Freud, but it was for a period a sort of dominant concept of consciousness. Be like Barb. Oh, be like Barb. Stranger Things, I bet, right? So like I have a bunch of plants right next to me. I don't know if I've ever shown you my urban garden. But, panpsychism would speculate that perhaps some of those plants have a form of consciousness. As somebody who studies what is, at least as far as we're aware, the primary engine of consciousness, I say as far as we're aware, as all modern neuroscientific evidence stipulates, essentially, identifies, the brain is the generator of consciousness. And we could go through some of those lines of evidence if you'd like. But I don't see, I look at a nervous system, or if I see evidence of conscious behavior, conscious intelligence, just consciousness, I will look for things like excitable cells, right? Assuming it's biological, right? An artificial intelligence, different conversation. And whether or not an artificial intelligence would be conscious, also an interesting conversation. But if I, see movement that is in response to some kind of environmental stimuli, if I see some evidence of intentional, activity, if I see some organism taking in energy and expelling waste, then what I will look for is some evidence that a cell is capable of undergoing very rapid transitions. Of course, it's nighttime, so I can't show you. I have a plant. It's called mimosa. Mimosa. It's like mimosa revulsion. Mimosa pudica. Mimosa pudica. So this is a plant that can move. This is a plant that can move in response to sensory stimuli. What's up, NYC boy? Meaning, if you disturb one of the leaves, the leaves themselves move, and if you disturb one of the stems will droop, as though it were dying and wilting. And it's transient. It will come back to its open state. Now, is that evidence of consciousness? It's moving in response to sensory stimuli. Well, no. We know a lot about the biology underlying the ability of those leaves to close. And it is a very specific input-output that results in that movement. What I would look for is a more versatile ability for excitable cells to handle information, take in stimuli of some sort, do some kind of even simple computation, and then convey some sort of output as an evidence that something is conscious. And so when I look at like an atom, I just don't see nearly enough complexity. And complexity isn't the only thing that will generate a consciousness, but there's just not enough of a substrate there for something like consciousness. Doesn't mean that they're not cool or not important, but that's why I've never seen any convincing articulation of panpsychism that isn't just like a game of semantics, really. Is it a carnivore plant? No, it's not a carnivore plant. This is purely, it exhibits something called phygmonasis. I think that's the term. Basically, it is a movement that is directed by some kind of environmental stimulus. In this case, it's like if you touch the leaves. I showed it on a... Well, you know what? I tweeted out a video of it on my Twitter, _anthropoid. And it's really cool. This thing is getting really tall, too, by the way. But all right. Doctors have described the heart and stomach as secondary brains. Is that justified? Richard Lovell. Yeah, it is interesting terminology. They do that for different reasons. So first of all, there is nothing like the brain in the human body, right? 86 billion neurons, at least as many other type of brain cells called glial cells, hundreds of trillions of synaptic connections between these 86 billion neurons and glial cells. Nothing like that, nor the architecture, like how those brain cells are connected to one another, exists anywhere else in the body. There are, however, other collections of a ton of neurons in other parts of the body. When it comes to the stomach, we're talking about the enteric nervous system. So that has a ton of neurons. In fact, it has enough neurons, and it's organized in such a way as it can function independently of the central nervous system. So even without a brain, the enteric nervous system would do its job. It also synthesizes a full repertoire of neurotransmitters. Serotonin, for example, a lot of it is synthesized in the gut. Importantly, that serotonin is not the serotonin that gets into the brain. Separate synthesis pathways. The heart, of course, possesses excitable cells. It is regulated largely by the central nervous system, but it exhibits pacemaker activity, which is why we call those little things that you put on the heart if somebody's at risk for fibrillation of some sort, a pacemaker. But anyways, there's also the proximity of the vagus nerve to the heart. Sometimes they just sort of mean the chest, but broadly speaking, the nervous systems of those two compartments are not nearly as complex, but also they're not organized in a way that would generate consciousness. They're organized in a way that would be very effective at achieving a certain thing. But be it digestion, interacting with an external surface, an external environment, and extracting certain nutrients, or to ensure that you have very consistent rhythmic firing or contraction of muscle. The brain, in and of itself, by the way, it can't even do those things, but that's not what's important for consciousness, which is why, for example, theoretically, you could sustain consciousness even if you had a head transplant onto like a robot of some sort, theoretically, right? So, can you do a private group for followers that are serious about brain science? Well, I mean, you can always reach out on Twitter. There's also a Slack group that, unfortunately, I've just totally neglected because of the baby. But listen, you can always just reach out on Twitter. We can chat. What's the best way to get dementia sufferer agitated? What's the best way to get a dementia sufferer agitated? I don't even want to entertain that notion. I think that's extremely immoral to agitate somebody with dementia. Dementia, I mean, the reason that I just find that way is like dementia, I think, is one of the most devastating conditions that arise out of the brain. Maybe the most, because this is a person who is not outwardly deteriorating. They're not experiencing organ failure. They're able to live. But the thing, again, here's some more evidence that the brain is what generates consciousness. The thing that determines who they are, their personality, their memories, their love, their hate, their concept of self is what's deteriorating. And that's horrifying. And if you've never seen it, then you might be prone to underestimating just how devastating it can be. But one of the symptoms of dementia is agitation, right? People can become easily agitated. So perhaps you meant that was like an autocorrect thing, or you meant to say something else, but I would not try and agitate them. Vidalga, hello from Brazil. I have noticed lately that the people I know have had lapses of memory. I'm sorry to hear that. Memory is one of these very fragile systems, very sensitive to lifestyle, sleep, drug use, age. So it could be a variety of different things. What causes receding hair? I'm currently dealing with the receding hairline right now. Perhaps it has to deal with my diet. Layback Dre. Well, you and me both, brother. Receding hairline is a byproduct of just genetics. It's entirely genetics, and it's a byproduct of the fact that testosterone is converted to another molecule in the scalp called DHT that will attack hair follicles and interfere with the sort of the growth cycle of hair. And so as a result, and this is, whether or not you inherited the genes for that is genetically determined. And I did. So yeah, need mods. So sometimes, there are some people that have been mods, but generally speaking, I think it's okay if people are a little mean or whatever in the chat. This is the internet. You're not going to have a completely sanitized environment. And frankly, I've been able to engage with enough trolls and convert them to be civilized people, at least within the context of these conversations, that it's fun for me. So I'm mod, but y'all don't know it. Yeah, right. NYC boy, I'd be happy to. The limbic system controls memory, right? No, not quite. Although parts of the limbic system are certainly associated with memory. The limbic system, generally speaking, refers to a distributed brain network that really largely regulates mood. And oftentimes I think when people hear mood, they sort of underestimate just how important mood is. I study parts of the limbic system, I should say. Maybe I'm a little bit biased, but mood is the very system that the brain evolved that is responsible for guiding behavior, right? You don't engage in a behavior if you know that it's going to be bad for you and you get no reward from whatsoever. And how is that reward experienced? But via mood. The reward can be satisfaction of seeing your child grow or learn a new thing, or it can be the high that you get from heroin. So somebody's calling in. Looks like Brit might be their name. The thanks, Ian. Gotta go. We'll watch replay in the podcast. Right on. Yeah, so I have a podcast. It's called Wired to be Weird. Check it out. Wired to be Weird. And so, Brit, where are you calling from? And is that your name, Brit?
I'm calling from Vietnam. I'm an Australian expat political refugee.
Very cool.
Cool. Yeah, I don't want to talk about that. I've actually seen, in my travels, I've come to investigate someone who was doing public speaking events on transhumanism at the Brisbane Library in Australia. He slurped T1 on Twitter, and he gets out of jail in December this year for child porn. His name is Matthew Hind. There's lots and lots of rumors and conspiracy theories about human brain interfaces and transhumanism. What have you actually, what academic papers have you read on this subject to tie it all to reality?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting topic. I'm totally unfamiliar with the person you named. Matthew Hines, is that the name?
Yeah, Hynd.
Okay.
Matthew Hind. If you want to know more, Robert Stacey McCain, a Washington Times reporter, when he got banned from Twitter for hate speech against LGBTQI, XYZ, whatever, he was the #1 trending hashtag on Twitter in the USA for a week a few years back with Free Stacey. He used my research and credited me for the research on him in his article, Australian FBI child porn fugitive was a gay crusader down under. You can just Google those terms and find the article on theothermccain.com.
Wow.
But yeah, one thing I never really investigated was his. I mean, I found blog posts about him doing transhumanism public speaking in the in the Brisbane Library, and the newspapers praising him. The mainstream news only praised him. I was the person that broke the media blackout on him being convicted for child porn. The Guardian had a story praising him for trying to sponsor an illegal immigrant Pakistani visa overstayer to stay in Australia, and 150,000 LGBTs try to support this FBI child porn fugitives cause to plus one his pedo mate into the country. And, you know, I call up immigration after his boyfriend got extradited back to America and jailed. And, you know, under the Migration Act in Australia, Section 501, the visa sponsor must be of good character. But immigration let Ali Chowdhury, his boyfriend, stay in the country, and the government ruled child porn is okay if you're gay. It's not a blemish on your character.
Okay, well, listen, Britt, I honestly, I've certainly lost the thread here.
I just want to know about transhumanism, what he was talking about. Is there some real science going on there?
Okay.
With human brain interfaces? What's going on? Is it suppressed technology, or what have you heard about that?
Sure. So you know, again, I know nothing about the case you just brought up. I don't want to, you know, nothing that I say has any relevance to that gentleman.
I mean, he's not going to reply to you on Twitter right now because he's in jail.
Okay, well, that sounds like he ought to be. But listen, okay, so Britt, so transhumanism is a concept. For anybody that's not familiar, is a concept that, due to the nature of human consciousness, we will be able to transcend our biological sort of substrate and, you know, perhaps encode our human consciousness onto a computer system and thereby, you know, expand human consciousness in a bunch of different ways, right? And so, broadly speaking, you know, there aren't very many biomedical scientists who call themselves transhumanist researchers. I usually see that term being used by people who are more enthusiasts, or perhaps, you know, futurists, people that are just very interested in technology, and in as scrupulous a way as they can, they evaluate innovation in science.
This person had a research tenure at a university in Albany, New York.
Wow.
And then he when he got raided by the FBI, he said it was my flatmate's laptop and run back to Australia. So this was actually a tenured researcher.
Interesting. I mean, listen, I've written down his name, and I'm definitely going to check it out. It sounds very interesting.
You can look him up on the BOP.gov.
Yeah. I got it. Britt.
That's how I found out when he gets out of jail.
Britt, I got it. So I've talked a fair amount about whole brain computer interfaces, because at a minimum what you would need is some kind of platform that would be able to interface with a sufficient sample of the brain, 86 billion neurons, that it would be able to record the activities of those neurons, decipher them in some way, using some kind of algorithm, and then interface with the computer, right? And this is, you know, a concept that is enticing to the likes of Elon Musk, who has recently founded a company called Neuralink, the goal of which is to develop some kind of whole brain computer interface. And as wacky as that does sound, the board is composed of heavy hitters in science, people that have been working on developing the sort of basic technology necessary for a whole brain computer interface. And so, you know, the short story is, I talked about this a lot on the podcast called Wired to be Weird on iTunes and Stitcher. And, you know, we talked about what it would be like to realize this technology, what some of the avenues of research that are ongoing today that might yield this are. But the short story is it possible that human consciousness could transcend the wet work of our biology? Sure, human consciousness arises from the brain, and it obeys the laws of physics, just like your computer does. It's just that the level of complexity in the human brain, and therefore human consciousness, is so much greater that we still have to amass more knowledge before we're capable of competently, you know, engaging the consciousness on that level.
Well, I have two more relevant questions relating to neuroscience. One is just a bit of a factoid I saw. I saw Facebook actually had a press conference where they were claiming to develop a technology that can read your thoughts, your self-monologue, when you think to yourself and you can hear your own voice. If you hear other people's voices, then you're schizophrenic, but when you can hear your own voice, that's normal in your head, and they wanted to use that as a quiet way of typing without using tactile actions with your hand, just thinking what you wanted to write. Is that even plausible, or is that just a pipe dream for investors?
It's totally possible, which is wild. I know it sounds insane, and your skepticism is very warranted. I should say it's possible. The best demonstration.
I've been playing with TensorFlow too. I know what AI can do and what it can't do, but this seems implausible. Another really relevant question. There's a guy called James Cantor, PhD, at the University of Toronto, and like he was recently on Don Lemon's show on CNN.
Okay.
There's a Huffington Post headline about the encounter. Don Lemon says he feels sorry for Jerry Sandusky in Huffington Post, of all places. But James Cantor is writing papers saying that children or babies are born pedophile, and we have to accept pedophiles because they're born that way. He's only using EKGs to come to these conclusions. Do you think that's real science or pseudoscience?
I mean, honestly, again, you're bringing up something that I have zero familiarity with. I would be shocked if somebody like Don Lemon would say that.
You can look up James Cantor. He's a guy that runs all the minor attracted pedo groups in Toronto. He scares the hell out of me too, but I've never been able to talk to a real neuroscience. So if you could come back to your listeners at a later time after reading his paper and try and critique him, I'll be incredibly grateful. So that's why I'll follow you.
Okay. Yeah, I know.
James Cantor, PhD.
Yeah, I found it. Okay. Well, so yeah, interesting topics. And I should say just before we wrap up, the idea of a technology that could decipher brain activity and deliver some kind of language output. The best demonstration I've seen of that was at the Society for Neuroscience 2 years ago in Washington, D.C. And there's a group out of Austria who has developed a remarkably effective interface using just EEG that was able to compose sentences from somebody just sitting there in silence. Oftentimes they use eye tracking and stuff like that, but no, this was using EEG. But anyways, listen, Britt, a bunch of interesting topics. I wish I knew more about some of them, but I'm going to look into it, and I hope to talk to you again.
I'm spent now on the neuroscience topic, so that way I'll thank you very much for it. If you can get back to me on those answers, I'd really appreciate it.
I'm going to check them out. Don't worry about it. So yeah, thanks for calling in. I've never heard of either of those folks that he highlighted, so I didn't want to comment either way. But I should say there is news on those folks. So okay, so oh weird, Brian. I don't know why all I can hear is. Are you using two devices?
Yeah.
So can you turn down one of them? Because I can hear myself.
Is this better?
Let's see. No. Well, listen. Okay, Brian, just tell me what's on your mind.
I was really interested about the dementia topic.
Okay.
And I also feel like I'm suffering from it.
Oh wow, I'm sorry to hear that. Okay. So what's on your mind?
Well, dementia is what, a progressive loss of your neurons?
Sort of. It's so. Listen, Brian, because there's this weird feedback. Just tell me what your main topic is.
True. Like, what do you recommend for people who may think they're suffering from dementia or already have signs already? Yeah.
Okay. Gotcha, Brian. I'm gonna let you go because of this echo. But I'll talk about it now. Yeah, sorry about that. That's frustrating, Brian. So, I mean, first of all, the first thing you should do is go to your physician and say, hey, I'm worried that I'm suffering from dementia. And then they will be able to put you on a clinical pathway that, first of all, will be insured, assuming you have insurance, where you'll go see a specialist of some sort, probably a neurologist who will probably order, be like Barb is saying, something like a CT scan or you know, an MRI or something to see if there's some kind of damage associated maybe with any injury you've had. But then probably before that, what they'll do is give you a cognitive test, a battery of questions. In fact, this became prominent all of a sudden when President Donald Trump was given this test that is intended to test for dementia. And you know, it's a fairly simple test. It tests, you know, how aware you are of your environment, of you know, the date, who the president is, you know, questions like that. And essentially they compare your performance to other people around your age. And then if you score at below a certain threshold on that test, then they will be able to determine whether or not you may or may not have dementia. Unfortunately, that is usually how dementia is diagnosed. There are multiple forms of dementia. You know, also Alzheimer's disease is the most common, but you know, frontotemporal dementia, Lewy body dementia, vascular dementia, there's a bunch. And unfortunately, we have yet to progress to the point where we can cure it or reverse it. We're making good progress there, though. But generally speaking, they will potentially you can enroll in a clinical trial, of which there are many. But they might prescribe you some palliative medications to help deal with the symptoms, or they might have a conversation with you and just it turns out that you don't have dementia, but how are you sleeping? What's your diet like? Do you ever exercise? How often do you challenge your brain? I mean, do you just get home from work, or if you don't work, do you just hang out and consume the same kind of information, the same media, and never challenge yourself? And so, but that's you got to go talk to a physician about this. Oh my God, if Usama's calling in, I gotta answer. So Usama, back hair. Where are you calling from? What's on your mind?
I'm calling from Northern California, and I was interested. I heard that there is a link between Porphyromonas gingivalis and dementia or Alzheimer's. That somehow it crosses the blood-brain barrier, and there's some way that it can cause Alzheimer's, and that if I wonder if you've read or heard about it.
So, wait, say it again. Pheromonas gingeralis?
Porphyromonas gingivalis.
Is this like a parasite or some kind of like virus?
Some disease. Periodontitis bacteria.
Okay. Got it. Yeah. Okay. So yes, there are lines of research that focus on the presence of certain bacteria or microbial populations, various body compartments, and an increased likelihood of dementia. I'm not specifically familiar with gingivitis, but there is like this interesting relationship between having the sort of chronic inflammation that arises from having some sort of pathogen, essentially some kind of microbial population. In your mouth is certainly one that I've seen discussed a lot, but there are particularly like microbial populations in the gut that are strongly correlated with dementia. I'm not aware of any studies that have specifically honed in and shown causative evidence that candida in the gut causes dementia, but there's definitely like the inflammatory pathway that people oftentimes highlight, that like just this chronically elevated inflammation may cause this cascade where in certain vulnerable people who are genetically vulnerable to dementia or have experienced some kind of injury to the head might then begin to develop dementia. But if there's a recent paper that came out, I haven't seen it yet.
I think I read it on science.com, and I looked it up on not the CDC website. I think it was NHCI.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I'm not sure what that stands for. Anyway, yeah, I read that there seemed to be some sort of a link, and that it was pretty groundbreaking that they discovered that that particular bacteria was found in, or the poison that it causes was found in the brains of Alzheimer's patients that they studied.
Yeah, I mean, so I'll check out, I'll look for this more recent publication, but I mean, we can just prepare ourselves for a kind of constant stream of papers that identify a strong correlation between a microbe of some kind and, any given kind of disease. And so it wouldn't surprise me, but thanks for bringing it up, Usama, and I'll be sure to check it out.
No problem. Thank you.
All right. Well, it's been a while, so I talked again on YouTube about some of the issues that a certain physician with experience treating the patients from Chernobyl, he had some critiques of the TV show Chernobyl, talked about that, and then I also talked about a theory of the emergence of consciousness in the context of evolutionary biology on YouTube. You can check it out if you'd like. It's a more prepared delivery where I'm just going through the information a little bit more rapidly. You just type in like Ian McLaughlin or Ian Anthropoid Brain or something like that. It'll probably come up. And then I have a podcast. It's called Wired to be Weird, and it's on iTunes and Stitcher and Spotify and all the places where fine podcasts are found. Otherwise, I will be here again on Sunday if I neglected to get to your topic. It was not on purpose. And so I hope to see you then. Same time, or not, about 4:30, 4 o'clock, 4:30 this coming Sunday. Hope to see you there. If not, have a great rest of your week. See you guys. Okay, and goodbye, YouTube.